I have something to say. A confession I should make before starting today's episode. I really didn't like the Sonic the Hedgehog live-action movie.
That second movie was such a banger, though!
I gave the second movie a shot, but it was even worse than I expected, and I think of it as just mediocre.
Alright, I gotta be honest. At first, this episode was supposed to be about the first live-action Sonic movie, but then I realized I didn't want to start approaching one of the series I'm most attached to with a mostly negative video, and I thought that to better process what I thought of the movie, maybe going back to the beginnings was not only a fun idea, but also better than just ranting about a couple of movies I didn't like.
We can do that later. And to talk about today's topic, we gotta start with a game company that proved to be quite the thorn in the side of Nintendo in the early 90s.
Sega. How important you were to me. The Sega Master System was the first console I've ever played on, and the Sega Genesis was the first console I've ever owned myself. Through the years, how much I loved you, Sega. How much I cherished you. How much I suffered for you. How much I tolerated you. Despised you.
How much I hate you! Let me go! Bring this upset! I asked for it!
I'm sorry, there's just a lot of personal baggage with this company. Sega is an entertainment company that has been around since 1946, and while initially focused on the production of pachinko, slot machines and jukebox, it started to delve into video games in the 70s, especially in the arcade scene, where among its first games were Periscope, a really interesting shooting gallery game, and Head-On, a sort of racing take on the classic maze formula of Pac-Man. The arcade scene is where Sega found its first audience and a very good degree of success, but it was only a matter of time before the company put its eyes on the home console market. Their first attempt, the SG-1000, even had a bit of a head start on Nintendo's Famicom. Despite releasing on the same day, the SG-1000 had a better flux of games at launch, and the Famicom even had to be partially recalled because of a faulty circuit in many of its units.
Oh, fancy that!
As time went on though, the Famicom quickly gained steam and overtook the SG-1000, in part also thanks to its much bigger offering of third-party games, which Sega lacked because they didn't feel like it made sense to work with the same companies they were competing with in the arcade space. Not even the release of the Sega Master System helped to weaken Nintendo's still cracked grip on the home console market. Despite being somewhat superior to the Famicom and NES in terms of power, and finding its own niche audience in Europe, it just failed to make an impact internationally, and an increasingly frustrated Sega decided to put everything they had to manufacture a system that would use shrunk-down version of the components of their arcade machines for its inner workings. And thus, the Sega Mega Drive, aka the Sega Genesis in America, was born. Granted, despite the Genesis being a fantastic system, this still wasn't enough to threaten Nintendo's 90% monopoly over the industry. It wasn't certainly a game quality problem. Even back then, Sega had quite an array of very good titles with their own charm. Space Harrier, Fantasy Zone, Super Hang-On, Phantasy Star, all amazing titles. Sega even tried having its own mascot with the Alex Kidd series, but it still couldn't quite break into people's hearts nearly as much as Nintendo's Juggernaut series, Super Mario and The Legend of Zelda. Sega needed something more. They were so adamant on finding a mascot that they even had an internal competition in the company, with around 200 characters being proposed by different employees. And this is where young developer Yuji Naka comes in. Having drafted a list of games he wanted to work on after the cancellation of his last project, one proposal in particular took the attention of Naka's superior, a game that would be able to challenge Super Mario. Intrigued by the developer's ambition, Naka's superior paired him with Naoto Oshima, another developer and artist who was trying to come up with a character that would be able to go beyond the traditional limits of a simple mascot character. With similar goals in mind, the two started to work together on a game concept about a character who'd be able to run really fast through levels, going around loops, and having the record-chasing appeal of a racing game. The early version of the game featured a 30s cartoon-style rabbit character who'd pick up items like rocks off the ground to attack enemies, but the developers soon ran into a problem when it came to this approach. In a game that should be all about speeding around, having to constantly stop to pick up items to defend yourself would break the pace of the gameplay, and Naka also insisted to keep the controls simple so that one could play the game with the input of a single action button.
This one-button rule was kind of Yuji Naka's signature developer trait, as he stuck by it through his whole career, And while it made sense for simpler games and allowed Naka to develop some true classics through the years, it eventually shown to be less of a philosophy and more of an obsession. But that's for another time.
This is where another developer on the team, the chief map designer, Hirokazu Yasuhara, suggested that using only one single button for the character's actions in a game would mean that the only way he'd be able to attack would be by jumping on enemies, which would leave him completely defenseless on the ground. It's Naka himself who came up with the solution, using an idea he had back in high school and was hoping to keep for the future. What if the character will be able to curl up in a ball and use the speed momentum of the game to roll into enemies? The idea was instantly picked up by the rest of the team, but it also caused another problem. Using a rabbit as a character suddenly didn't make sense anymore. Oshima started sketching right away, even taking suggestions from outside the company. He didn't have an easy task. He was supposed to create a character that would fit the game they were creating, that would become the mascot of Sega, and that would be strong enough to stand up to Nintendo's Mario. For this, Oshima tried to come up with something that would be perceived as a sort of rebel figure, someone who could be a people's hero, challenging the almighty monopoly of the bigger company, inspired by the cool factor that was taking shape in the early 90s. Oshima eventually ended up in New York for a business trip and decided to run a sort of personalized focus test. Taking a few character sketches to Central Park, Oshima showed them to people, asking to tell him which of the characters they liked the most. He came back from the test with 2 winners. In second place, a funny egg-shaped man with huge mustache. And in first place, a spunky-looking blue cartoon hedgehog. Oshima had his hopes renewed by this experience. He and his team, as mentioned before, wanted this character to be more than a funny animal mascot. They wanted him to be someone anyone in the world would be able to like, going beyond factors such as age, race, or gender. The spunky hedgehog proved to be quite popular inside the company as well, with the blue fur not only being a nod to Sega's logo, but also being considered a hopeful color, a reminder of the blue sky to Oshima in particular. The hedgehog also had some particular Western and especially American influences, with its aspect and expressivity being inspired of classic cartoon characters like Mickey Mouse and Felix the Cat, while the red and white color of his shoes recalled another universally popular figure, Santa Claus, as well as the design being inspired off the cover of the music album Bad from Michael Jackson. And apparently, the character's cool action-prone behavior was inspired by then future American President Bill Clinton's get it done now attitude?
What's up with this game series and American presidents?
At this point, all that was missing was a name. The character has been known as Mr. Needlemouse by the members of the team ever since his creation, but they knew they needed a name that expressed the focus of the game on speed. The term Kosoku, as in speed of light in Japanese, was thrown around, as well as Raisupi, an abbreviation of the Japanese pronunciation of the term, but in the end, they decided to settle on a simple yet effective striking term: Sonic. When they presented the newly named character and the related project to Hayao Nakayama, the then president of Sega of Japan, they were so determined to have the project greenlighted that they even had a plush of the character made to present alongside the game. Needless to say, they made an impression. With the new character in tow and the game's goals established, the team was eventually able to introduce to the world the title that would completely change the landscape of the platforming genre and inspire a whole generation of young people. Sonic the Hedgehog! Sonic the Hedgehog was released on the Sega Genesis in June 1991, and it turned out to be the biggest success that Sega ever had up to that moment, to the point where they eventually bundled it with the system. Speeding through the colorful landscapes, Sonic certainly made quite the spectacle at the time, inspiring so much confidence in Sega that to advertise the game, they even had ads running their title alongside Nintendo's major Super Nintendo title Super Mario World to highlight just how much cooler their own mascot and game was. Sega's marketing in general became really aggressive around this point, slandering Nintendo at every turn and positioning themselves as the cooler company, the one that tried cool, extreme new things, the one that didn't censor violence in games, which locked itself well within the scope of Sonic's rebel attitude and the growing sensibilities of the radical 90s, especially with their famous motto, "It's free, what Nintendo don't." You could also say that it helped nurture the whole console war culture that would rage among video game fans for the next decades, but it certainly helped to put Sega on the map back in the day. But enough about boring sales and advertising. Let's talk about the game itself. Sonic the Hedgehog is a platform game in which our titular character has to get through different levels known as zones, split in different acts, defeating an army of evil robots, and rescuing his friends from a mad scientist, Dr. Ivo Eggman Robotnik, who is conquering the island where the game takes place. It definitely makes a great first impression, as the game starts off in Green Hill Zone, a luscious green location created by mixing roller coaster elements with the coastal views of California, in which the players can come to terms with the game's mechanics and experience Sonic speed for the first time in what became one of the most iconic first levels in the entire history of video games.
And Sega eventually made sure you'd never, ever, and ever, and ever forget about Green fucking Hill Zone!
The very striking visual style of Sonic the Hedgehog is what helped its success, and it's probably among the first examples of a game having a certain visual flair to itself, as the 16-bit age started to give game developers and artists the tools to make the art direction of a game really shine through the screen. The twisty and natural geometry of a theme park ride, mixed with the natural mechanical elements, was made even more impressive to the eye thanks to the very particular use of eye-popping color contrasts, inspired by the art of Japanese artist Eijin Suzuki, in which you can find a lot of the artistic sensibilities that would be used through this particular era of the game series. This is coupled with the style used on the characters, which mixed the simple shapes of a classic rubber-hose American cartoon with the sleek, stylish look of a Japanese production. Sonic hits that very fine line between being cute and cool looking, especially in-game, in which his sprite sports quite the amount of personality for the time, looking so determined and focused as he runs across the lands, getting impatient at the player and tapping his foot if he stands idle for too long, giving the idea of a character that doesn't want to stand still, eager to get into action and save the situation. Robotnik's robots also sport quite the personality, looking goofy but with a bit of an edge if you know what I mean, still coming off as enough of a threat, as if being the creations of a weapon-making madman who liked theme park mascots a little too much, a theme that would just get more and more refined going forward through the Genesis years. Sonic the Hedgehog wanted to be a spectacle from start to end, showcasing not only the power of the system it was on, but also the creativity of its team and how they would stand out if compared to the rival Nintendo. The game is still quite the visual outlier today, and believe me when I say that it will only get better and better in the following games on the system.
Now, let me remind you of the premise of the game. Sonic's friends have been captured by Eggman, imprisoned into robots, and he has to rescue them. Pretty simple story, summed up in a few words, gets the point across very efficiently. And yet, well, there's a bit more to it.
Sonic the Hedgehog is set on a mysterious South Island, a quite particular piece of land that cannot appear on any map due to being able to sail through the seas like a ship, never staying in the same place for long. This unique behavior is said to be caused by the presence of the Chaos Emeralds, 6 enigmatic gemstones containing an immense amount of power hidden somewhere on the island. This legend eventually picks up the interest of Dr. Ivo Eggman Robotnik, a megalomaniac scientist who wants to harness the power of the emeralds for his own evil plans. Setting base on the island, establishing a mechanical headquarters and calling it Scrap Brain Zone, the Doctor starts to capture and enslave the local fauna, using the animals as an internal source of energy for his machines, which are then scattered through the island to dig around and look for the powerful gems. As Sonic arrives on the island, having visited it several times before, he finds his friends captured and locked away, and the blue blur immediately springs into action, running through the island to rescue his friends from their mechanical prisons and defeat the Mad Doctor, with which he has quite the history already. You can easily tell how, despite the superficially simple premise, there seems to be a level of cohesion and lore to this story that, at least until then, was really uncommon for platform games. This was the age where game narrative was evolving already, but Sonic the Hedgehog is one of the very first examples of a platform game trying to establish a coherent world building. The total opposite of Super Mario games, where the story is as simple as it gets, and the game's world aims to be more similar to a sort of Alice in Wonderland-like experience that back then even played with the concept of the game being a stage play. Wacky and nonsensical, which is also what became part of its charm for many. The Sonic team wanted to be more ambitious when it came down to its story and world though. Give its characters and games a sort of natural progression, linked by cohesive rules, a background lore, and an escalation that would bring them toward an epic conclusion. Although, Sega of America kind of got in the way. There were many concerns at the American branch of Sega regarding the success of Sonic outside of Japan, as they deemed the game too weird and were especially concerned by the use of a hedgehog as a mascot, which wasn't exactly a popular or known animal in the States back then. They eventually bought into the game's potential once they saw it in action, but they also made some changes to make the game more relatable to American audiences. Besides greatly simplifying the story to its most basic elements, they also hired famous American artist Greg Ray, known for his amazing illustration for Disney and Warner Bros., to redesign Sonic so that it'd be more in line with Western sensibilities. It's the design that all Westerners of my generation grew up with, and let's just say that Yuji Naka and the others at Sonic Team weren't exactly fans of what was being done to their pet project, to the point where American Sega representatives had to fly over to Japan to talk with the team and assure them that all of this was only to assure that the game would succeed in the States.
Granted, I'm not a fan of what was done to the story of the games. Dumbing down the plot elements implies very unsavory things about what you think of your own audience, but to be fair, it could have been worse. Much, much worse.
Apparently, the earliest draft for the westernization of Sonic the Hedgehog was even more of a departure from the original vision. In this version, Sonic didn't originally have his incredible speed, and he was a pretty normal brown cartoon hedgehog known as Sonny, living in Hardley, Nebraska.
What? What?
Sonny eventually befriended a kind scientist called Dr. Kintobor. Oh, how clever! Who was the one to gift him his trademark red and white shoes. As the two worked together on experiments, eventually a tragic accident turned Sonic blue and gave him his speed powers, while Kintobor was instead corrupted and became the evil scientist known as Robotnik. This story never became official, as the manual settled for a very simplified version of Sonic Team's story, but the Sonic storyline was eventually adapted by one of the many comic adaptations of Sega's Blue Hedgehog, Sonic the Comic. It's an experience.
The different Sonic comics, especially the ones from Archie, are its own very chaotic Pandora's box, and while absolutely tempting to cover, I don't think I'll ever be able to do it. They're way too... After all, why not? Why shouldn't I open it? No! Not doing that! Bad idea! Awful idea!
I think it's time to focus on the gameplay a little. One of the best qualities of Sonic the Hedgehog is probably how easy and intuitive it is to pick up and play. This is where Yuji Naka's one-button philosophy shines, as Sonic is able to do 3 basic actions: run, jump, and roll. This is all he needs to get through levels, jumping or rolling into enemy robots to dispose of them, and using the momentum-based mechanics of the game to roll or run at such neck-breaking speeds that, at its fastest, the Hedgehog is able to even outrun the game's camera, making for quite the spectacle for the player. It's a game that is clearly born out of the arcade origins of Sega as a company, as the title is designed in such a way that players can get better with each subsequent playthrough, clearing stages in faster times, an element that survives in the series even to this day. And talking about stages, Sonic will find himself into different locations, from luscious green coasts to flooded underground ruins, capping off with Eggman's mechanical base. It's a fair selection of locations, all very distinct in the way they're designed, as the devs wanted every stage to feel like its own place, with its own architecture, as according to their ambitions about the world building of the game. Granted, being the first game, it wasn't a flawless attempt. It's a common complaint, for example, that the second level, Marble Zone, contradicts the game's focus on speed, making Sonic pretty much unable to reach a certain velocity due to being set in a maze of cramped ruins filled with traps and careful platforming sections that puts the brakes on our main character, so that you go from this to this. To be quite honest, I can see what the devs were trying to do. Every level of the game seems to want to do its own special thing. Springyard Zone, for example, is a city outskirts stage with a loose casino theme, filled with bouncers, springs and neon lights, a theme that would be eventually expanded on in the next games. While Labyrinth Zone is a set of flooded ruins, focusing on the tension of Sonic having to get through underwater sections without drowning, which can be avoided by finding air bubbles scattered around the level. Not all of these concepts are speed-friendly. Even though the level design is always interesting, if kind of unfair at times, the more speed-prone players might find themselves with an uneven experience. Although it was clear that the devs clearly wanted the game to feel like an actual adventure, with its own progression and unique set of challenges, all ramping up to the game's final level, set in Eggman space, filled to the brim with deadly contraptions. It's something that it would execute way better in later games though.
I personally don't mind the slower sections of the game. I mean, it's the first game, you can't nail everything on the first try, and you can't make history by being a perfectionist, and the levels are still so fun to get through.
The game also featured a novel life system for the time. As opposed to having a number of hit points, the devs instead opted for their own approach, scattering rings around the levels for Sonic to pick up. Those rings are not only a way for Sonic to earn an extra life once he'd pick up a certain amount of them, but they also acted as a shield for him, as upon being hit by an enemy, instead of killing him, the rings would simply fly off his body. This was another way to flex the power of the system by showing so many in-game items or screens, but also a way for the pace of the game to not slow down for too long, as the player could just pick up even one ring to resume their speeding through the levels without fear of an imminent death, also helped by the presence of some useful power-ups, like an additional shield, invincibility, and a speed-up one that would further push Sonic's speed to new levels. The rings are also crucial to clear the secondary goal of the game, getting all of the 6 Chaos Emeralds, which can be acquired by accessing special zones that can only be entered by jumping into a giant portal ring at the end of the level, which will appear only if Sonic has 50 rings on him. The portal will then bring Sonic into these psychedelic stages, rolling around into perpetually spinning mazes filled with direction-changing switches, bouncers, and traps, trying to get at the end to acquire one of the emeralds. They are an additional challenge to the player's playthrough, even though the reward is no more than a sort of better-ending screen. We'll have to wait the next game for the emeralds to give something more generous. It's interesting to note that the ethereal background of the special stages has been inspired from Infinite Asher and Metamorphosis, 2 films developed by Sony to promote certain technological features of their devices. Those stages have been the source of many headaches for me. Every classic Sonic game has its own special stages, and it's an active debate on which system is the most frustrating. But I'd argue on this first made system being the winner. It controls very awkwardly. Most of the time your jumps just won't go the way you want, and it's not uncommon for the game to just decide to give you a middle finger for the hell of it.
I'm not even saying anything. How can I top that?
The ring system was also key in making the boss fights against Eggman quite tense, as depending by the way Sonic is hit, rings could just fly off the screen, leaving the Hedgehog completely defenseless to any more damage. It's a system that lasted for the majority of the main series. It's just that good. And since we mentioned the villain of the game, let's talk about him. Let's talk about Dr. Evo Eggman Robotnik. It's not a surprise that Eggman made such an impact right from the first game. Like Sonic, he started out as a pretty simple but effective villain, a mad scientist with a brilliant mind and an inflated ego, to the point where he's not even afraid to get his own hands dirty and get into action in every single stage of the game through the use of his different models of Eggmobiles. Through the majority of the game, he's always there at the end of the current zone, not even giving Sonic the satisfaction of a full defeat, as at the end of every boss fight, the player can only manage to push the Doctor in a tactical retreat, as he flies off deeper into the island. He is a man of action, always ready to face Sonic by himself, an alleged threat despite the goofy cartoony look, inspired of one of the many scrapped ideas for the main character of the game, as well as Theodore Roosevelt?
What's up with this game series and American presidents?
While Eggman's goals aren't entirely clear in the first game, other than wanting to tap into the power of the Chaos Emeralds, the way he uses live animals as power sources for his mechanical creations, and the resilience he shows coming back from every defeat with a new kind of deadly machinery, gives the sense of a villain that, in a way, is just as determined as Sonic to get his goals achieved. And while this wasn't expanded upon in this first title yet, Eggman would eventually prove to be one of the best developed characters in the series, with his own idealism and his twisted view of what the world should look like, working his way to build his own utopia of machines and theme park imagery. His robots in the original game already represent this contrast, with the kinda cutesy mascot like Max sporting deadly weaponry of every kind, and Eggman himself already kind of looking like the ringleader of a demented mechanical circus. I'm pretty much restraining myself from speaking too much about him, as I feel like lots of the following games built upon the initial simple premise of the first title to flesh out his threat in such a spectacular way. Oh boy, I can't wait! But to wrap up my tangent, Eggman is a constant presence in the first game, a good mix of goofiness, balanced with a legit sense of danger due to the constant robots he throws in Sonic's way, or the traps he sets up to get rid of the pesky Hedgehog.
Of course, the game wouldn't feel the same if it didn't have an equally impressive musical score.
The score of the first game was composed by Masato Nakamura, the bassist of the Japanese band Dreams Come True. It's incredible how so many of the people involved in the origins of this series had such huge ambitions to make something really special. In Nakamura's case, while he only had concept art for the characters and the stages to base himself off of, he had a clear idea in mind. He wanted to treat this game's soundtrack as a film score that would carry out the mood of the scenes in a cinematic manner. To put it in his own words, I wanted Sonic to come across as cinematic. I wanted melodies that the player would hum along with as they were playing, dramatic music for when the scenes were intense, climatic music for when the bosses would show up, and then tie it all together with an uplifting theme for the end credits. That was what I knew I wanted it all to be like. It shouldn't come as a surprise that Sonic the Hedgehog made such an impact on so many players when this was the energy behind it. While not perfect and stumbling in places, the first title is still fun even today, especially with new ports retroactively adding features from newer games to make the original flow even better. It instilled a powerful sense of adventure into the player upon its original release. And this would only be the beginning, with the games of the Sega Genesis especially offering an experience that would just keep ramping up until its amazing conclusion at the end of the system's life. And while yes, the series has been struggling a whole lot in recent years, it should be kind of a testament to how much potential is there when, despite everything, the character is still such a powerful icon for many. There's an ambition that just isn't the norm when it comes to this genre. And yes, while the ambition has certainly faltered during a specific number of years, especially thanks to Sega's mishandling of the series and its characters, the fact that there are still so many who believe in the character should show just how powerful his appeal is.
This is gonna be a wild, rocky series to cover. I'm not gonna lie, there are gonna be many ups and downs, but damn it if it's not gonna be fun. A fun way for me to relive the series, and a fun way to process exactly why I think the movies were so mediocre to me. Before wrapping things up, I want to say how a lot of the work for this video was made easier by the website Sonic Retro. The research work on the development of Sonic games was nothing short of outstanding, and I suggest you to look them up if you want more info and tidbits about how those games were made. For now, see you around, Dwellers. Until next time!